Hello, this is Barbara Field. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in Sacramento, California. And the purpose of my YouTube channel, The Journey of Grief, Becoming Us Without Them, is so people can know that they're not alone and that their journey is okay and everybody gets to grieve their own way in their own time, and creating space for people that are grieving different kinds of losses. So today I've invited Maurice Geddis to talk to us about athletics and grief and all of that stuff that he specializes in. So Maurice, how about if you tell us about yourself and talk to us about grief?
Sure. Well, hello, my name is Maurice Geddis, and I'm a licensed married family therapist in Davis, California. And I'm so honored and appreciative of you, Barbara, inviting me back for part two. I wasn't thrilled with part one, but part two will be much more informative about athletes and their grief.
Cool. So, what would you like us to know?
Well, athletes have grief. I mean, when it comes down to it, athletes are people. I specialize in working with college. I've worked with some pro athletes and even some high school athletes, but they experience grief just like anyone else. In my experience as a marriage and family therapist, I've worked with athletes probably for the last 6 or 7 years. And one of the biggest aspects of college athletes in grief is how to balance being an athlete and being an academic, being a student. That's a very tough balancing act. You figure if you're spending at least 20 hours, 25 hours a week studying, sports is the other 20 hours, so that's 45 hours. And if you tack on some student athletes have to work, you're going to tack on another 15 hours to that. So that's a heavy, heavy load. And just balancing that can cause any level of grief, everything from anxiety and depression to just not feeling that they can cope with the demands that are placed upon them. And that's just the start and the tip of the iceberg. I usually see athletes usually come to me when they are experiencing injury. That's one aspect of what they do. They'll come to me when they're experiencing personal, interpersonal relationship issues in their private lives. And they'll come to me when they're not satisfied with their performance. They're not in the position that they want to be in. They want to get more playing time. So all of these things combined, it's a day-to-day chore for the average athlete, college athlete anyway, to navigate.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about, so when an athlete is doing great and it's working and the team's winning, then they're sort of riding the crest of that and everything is good. And then life takes them down a peg, whether they have a career-ending injury or the team makes a choice outside of their control that makes them feel devalued and unseen and unappreciated.
Absolutely. Well, to talk about how they respond to grief in circumstances outside of outside of anyone's control, there's two types of motivations for athletes that I typically look at. There's intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. An extrinsically motivated individual is going to really respond to a transactional leader, a coach who, you take care of me, I'll take care of you. That works sometimes, but when you take the carrot away from the athlete, what then is the motivation for the athlete? So you kind of look at that aspect of it. Then you look at the other side, an intrinsically motivated athlete. that athlete comes into the arena, the basketball court, football field, baseball diamond, a swimming pool, soccer field, wherever. They come in to the sport with a passion, something that's inside that says, this is who they are, this is what they want to do, and there's no question or doubt. You don't have to dangle a carrot in front of me. I'm going to do this, whether you tell me I can or not. So on the crest of when everything is working and everything is firing off on all cylinders, either one of those motivations, you're going to see some success. You're going to see the success of the team of the whole impact the individual. And that individual will ride that synergy along with everybody else on the team, the players, the coaches. But the minute they have to experience hardship or come against a challenge such as an injury, that's where you really see the difference between an intrinsically and an extrinsically motivated student athlete or an athlete. So the intrinsically motivated athlete will learn to take one day at a time in terms of the injury. They will learn to seek out the right support. They will look at what all of their options are, make some determinations that are going to be best for their health and then their sport. And there's some athletes, due to depression, because they are injured, they want to get back out to the playing arena as quick as possible. And we've seen that in professional and college sports. We've seen it time and time again where an athlete comes back too soon, and it's devastating for them. And that's where you start to talk about, life and career-threatening injuries. It's because they just did not have the insight in the patience to work through their anxiety over the injury. So, yeah.
Wow.
The anxiety is interesting. It's like anything. When you're injured, and you feel and you put it on your shoulders that other people are depending upon you. It's not you that's just injured. It's therefore you've created a rift in the perfect process. So now the process is no longer perfect in the mind of the athlete. And we talk about this in psychology all the time. It's the distorted cognitions that come up through, our cognitive functions, how our mind plays tricks on us. Oh my God, if I'm injured, I'm going to lose my starting role. If I'm injured, my dreams are not going to come true. If I'm injured, the coach and my teammates are going to be mad at me. If I'm injured, I'm a letdown. Now I appear to be weak. And it's all these different types of distorted thought processes that come up for the athlete. Now, you can't simply walk in working with the athlete and tell them that mindset is distorted, because that's really their experience. That's really what they're feeling. So it's an opportunity for me to go a little deeper with the athlete and kind of explore how they've always dealt with hardships in their life, or what type of hardship did they experience in their life history. And sometimes those things can really be helpful, because when you take them back to those things, even previous injury, those are wonderful, because if an athlete's had a previous injury, they can draw on that experience from when they went through the healing process prior and apply some of that. What'd you call that? I think I would call that insight. Yeah, positive insight, to assist them with taking the current injury day to day. So, Gestalt therapy is really, really encouraging, because it always says what? Stay and be in the here and now. And when athletes are going through injuries, I try to help them not to forecast 5 weeks down the road, 2 weeks down the road. I help them just to identify the things that they need to handle just for the day. Tomorrow's a new day. You set new goals for the next day. And that's kind of how you help them manage those situations.
And so those are like the kinds of losses that athletes need to grieve. If it's a temporary injury, it's hard enough. But
Absolutely.
if it ends your career, then all of those things, and for all of us, if you have a job that you love and your company goes out of business, you have to grieve who you were there, your coworkers, your commute, all the parts of who you were. And so
It's
it's that
identity.
thing with athletes, it's who I am.
Yes, yes. Who I am, and a lot of athletes, unfortunately, they don't know anything outside of that identity. Um, the interesting thing I'm at UC Davis, and it's a Division I school. It is a STEM school. It's world renowned. And the athletes there are slightly motivated differently because they are very cerebral. They're smart. They're smart people. And, their motivations are, well, I know I'm not going to play football necessarily the rest of my life. So school is part of the whole package. It's not just me playing football. Um, I came up under that regime, being a UC Davis graduate and ex-football player there. That was the vein that I came up in. So whether I had injury or not, or couldn't make it playing professional ball, my identity wasn't just football. It was, I got to make a life for myself, whether it's football or, finding a career. So that's a great segue to another aspect of their grief, and that is transition. Only 1% of all athletes ever make it playing in the big leagues and becoming a pro athlete. So what do the other 99% of those athletes do across the country? They have to transition. And, some are very well prepared for the transition. And then there are those tragedies that we hear about that where they're not making the transition.
So it kind of depends on if they do college to support the development of their career, or if they do school to support the development of their sport.
Yes, and there's both sides of that coin that motivate athletes. Um, you will see both, especially on the college rank. When you get on the professional level, it becomes more of a business. That dollar speaks volumes. That can cause grief all by itself. Athletes on the pro level, they experience grief much differently because then they take on, they're the primary breadwinner. They're going to make a lot of money, and all of a sudden they have family, friends, and people that they have never knew they were family. All of a sudden, there's a sense of, well, I guess I have to take care of everyone. And that's a huge sense of grief for professional athletes. I've worked with a few. Unfortunately, I had a teammate in college. He made it playing pro ball for a couple of years, and he succumbed to the profession, or succumbed to, the challenges of the profession, and he took his life. And, you hear about tragedies like that, and you just kind of like, where does that come from? How did that happen? So grief is very real for our athletes. Um, I'm working on my PhD right now in performance psychology out of Grand Canyon University, and the topic is gaining a descriptive study about enough is not known about the holistic wellness of male collegiate athletes. And as I was doing my research, one of the research findings that I came up with is that there's a higher percentage of suicide rate among college athletes than there are within the general college population nationwide. And I'm like, the college athlete population is very small in comparison to the rest of the college population. And if per capita their suicide rate is higher, that's significant to me. So that's going to be something I'm going to be paying attention to in my research findings to better understand that whole grief process. And if there's something that, a coach or sports psychologist like myself, or a family member or a friend or a relationship, something that can be said to that athlete to maybe alter that path, it would be great to have a better understanding of that.
It seems like there's a lot of pressure. It's a very performance-oriented world. I mean, all of college is, but in addition to going to college, people are forming peer relationships and social networks. And athletes don't have as much time for that. And so the other athletes become their peers, but at the same time, they're also competing for positions, playing time. And the coach, you can have the most relational coach in the world, but in the end, his job is based on getting a winning team and not just a friendly team. And so he wants to care about you as an individual and care about you as a student, but he also needs to care about whether or not you're performing. And that constant pressure of measuring up, and competing. So the people that are your best buds are also the people who want your space on the field. That seems very complicated.
It is. It's quite the management job for a coach. You got to remember, a coach is not a psychologist. Coach is not even, a coach may not be the perfect communicator. A coach is a coach. Coach is there to render results, and a coach has got to do what he's got to do to get the best results. He's got to make hard decisions on who's going to be best to render that result in that particular position. So while coaches can love all their players, there has to be an understanding that there's a hierarchy. And that's difficult for athletes to navigate as well. It's like, how do I accept that, I may be on scholarship, but I'll never be a starter? How do you reconcile that thought? And how does that thought not bleed into your personal life? In other words, am I just going to be second at everything in life? Or is it, these are the things that run through an athlete's mind, and it's very much part of their grief process. And if you don't have an understanding of that as a coach, yeah, you may not get the results that you want. And most college programs are built on winning. The Power 5 schools in this nation are the Division I schools that can generate the most capital for for their institutions. So, the big schools like Notre Dame and Michigan and Stanford and Cal and UCLA, and I can go on and on about more of the East Coast teams, Oklahoma and Texas, and the list goes on and on. Well, those schools generate huge revenue, so there's a huge pressure, a trickle down effect that ultimately that athlete is going to feel. He's going to feel the pressure of all of that.
Right. And so they've come up through high school, right? And typically they've been stars in their high school. They've been a big fish in a small pond, and there is a certain amount of expectation that comes that you'll always be a big fish. And then they get to college and suddenly they're a small fish in a big pond.
Yes.
And so that losing that sense of specialness and amazingness that comes from being a high school star and becoming, a scrub on the college team.
You kind of start all over again. And you got to have the mindset that this is temporary and this is just part of, par for the course. If I want to, master the next level, I have to remain humble about my circumstance. And that's tough for athletes to do. Steve Young has, his latest book, and I should have had it with me. But he talks about his plight sitting the bench behind Joe Montana back in the day. And he said he had a terrible, crappy attitude about it until one day he decided, well, it is true how I feel, and it is crappy sitting behind, Joe Montana, one of the greatest quarterbacks that there ever was. But I want to have my opportunity too. So I'm going to have to change my attitude about it. So what he came up with, and I talked to a lot of athletes going through this same very thing in terms of grief. It is true, it's crappy, but what is the truer truth? Is there a truer truth to your circumstance? Well, yeah, I'm on the team. Yeah, I'm second string. And yeah, I'm pretty dang good. And yeah, you know what? I just got here. And if I'm already second string, I just have to work a little harder in the gym, get a little stronger. I'm just a freshman. I'm going to probably get faster, may have a little growing left to do. And it's amazing, Barbara, when I've watched freshman athletes in college, and by the time they're seniors, they're like in beast mode. I'm like, how did that happen? It's maturity. And those who can weather that storm, weather that process, and understand that that process is taking place, those are the athletes who do well for themselves. And that's not to say all athletes are even going to get to that level. But again, it is the motivations. And I think the powers that be, the right players are always pretty much going to be in where they're supposed to be.
So let's talk about when it's not a temporary injury, it's over. And this is an athlete who's only in this college because they're on a scholarship, and they're only on this career trajectory because they're at this school on this scholarship. And the athletes go away, or the athletics goes away, and they lose their scholarship. They lose their trajectory, they lose their future. So what kind of support do people provide? How do you and colleges? I mean, that's serious grief. That's everything. I've lost my identity as an athlete, a team member, a college student, whatever I was going to be, an attorney, or what I was going to be is maybe gone forever. How are athletes supported in that? Are they left to just suck it up and pull it together themselves?
Well, I've worked with a number of those scenarios currently in past situations. When we are in our profession as therapists and we have, our clients come in and they're experiencing loss. And, we've kind of come up with the understanding that loss comes in a number of different forms. It could be loss of life of somebody close to you. It could be, loss of your income, loss of your home, loss of a relationship from divorce. And those four things all by themselves are significant. So when you start to talk about the magnitude of an athlete losing his identity, losing his ability to thrive, that's just as devastating. Just as devastating. So when those athletes come to me, yes, it's a full-on grief process. I'm assessing for depression. I'm assessing for the support that they would have. I'm assessing for how they've managed disappointment and trauma and strife in their past. And I'm monitoring for all of those things because they're very, very real.
And then as a professional athlete, like you mentioned before, it kind of becomes who they are. So people don't see Maurice anymore. They only see Maurice, the football player, and Maurice, the guy that can do stuff for me, and yes, Maurice, the guy that, I'm sure celebrities struggle with this. Yes. So you see different celebrities find different ways of feeling like their life has meaning aside from their music, or capitalizing on the fame to be able to do good stuff and make the world a better place. So with the athletes, they have a good bit of downtime between seasons,
Yes.
and that they've lived in the rush of the season and the rush of the fame and the rush of the drama. And then from now it's off season, no adrenaline.
Mm-hmm.
So how do they cope with that? Does that contribute to that suicide rate or?
It does. I've seen a lot of athletes really successfully manage that. You know, somehow they manage to stay grounded, that they realize that this sport is not going to last. They're not going to play this sport forever. Everybody can't be a Tom Brady and play well into his 40s. This just doesn't happen like that. Those athletes, they again, they get a good support system around them, both professionally, financially. They find a good financial planner. They create community nonprofits that they can, you know, kind of spread their wealth to where it's going to be residual income for them long term. They have great boundaries with family. And that's a huge, you know, your family of origin is a huge indicator of how you may navigate this thing that we call fame, you know, famous athletes. Um, some families, you know, I've heard horror stories where the entire family will quit working. Well, he made it. We don't have to work anymore. And he's taking care of everybody without question, without a discussion that, you know, you know, subordinate my life right now. Those are hard cases, because the grief behind that begins with psychotherapy having nothing to do with them being an athlete. It has everything to do with how they feel responsible for their family. So that is a tough scenario to work through. Um, and usually 10 out of 10 times, it's behind finances. It's just behind the wealth. Families that are better adjusted and more stable, you're not going to have parents that are, well, you know, I don't have to work anymore, and you're going to buy us this, and you're going to buy your mom that, and you know, yeah, those parents aren't like that. And I've had teammates that went on to play pro ball, and I've seen the parents that they live in the same house that their kid that they lived in before their kid made it big. It's not about them. It's about making sure that their child is thriving in the world. I've seen some parents, you know, successful athletes, their parents have managed their money most of their lives, and they've done very well by that. And then I've seen the horror stories where the athlete is playing and taking care of his family, and he's injured and can never play again. What does that athlete do?
Yeah, so those are, I noticed when my kids were playing at higher levels of soccer, there were parents who had lives, parents who didn't have lives. So this kid and their sport is my life. It's my social life. Those are my friends. That's what I do. That's what I'm consumed with. So you can see how those people would kind of think, after everything I've done to get you where you are, now you need to pay me back.
Well, yeah, and I hear those stories all the time, and you know, we don't have any control over those mindsets. You know, they're just some, you know, there are parents, there are people out there that, you know, I made all the sacrifices so that you can make it. Now you owe me. And I could never tell my child that you owe me. That just would never come out of my mouth that way.
Yeah.
It didn't come out of my parents' mouth. I mean, I had a number of tryouts in the pro rank, and my parents weren't waiting for me to, you know, cash a paycheck and buy them anything. It was, you take care of yourself. You make your life for you. We made the sacrifices so that you could have a better life, not to take care of us. And my mom
Yeah.
was adamant about that. She goes, "You're not doing anything for us." And that's, You know, that was good for me to hear that. I didn't feel the pressure of, okay, now what?
So just here at the end, I always ask people for like the 1 minute wisdom. If nobody listened to anything we said in this whole thing and you had 1 minute to say the most important thing, what do you think is the most important thing for people to understand about athletes and the things they have to grieve, and giving them permission, helping them have permission to grieve those losses and acknowledge those losses? So what is your wisdom for us about athletes and grief?
Any athlete hearing this, I really want you to hear this, you're still human. You're not supernatural. You put on your pants, you put on your clothing the same way anybody else does, male or female. You put on your uniform the same way anybody else would. So at the end of the day, when that uniform comes off, there's still a person there. And it's important and imperative that the athlete understands the person that they are outside of that arena.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much for being with us today. And
I really enjoyed this, and yeah, it was great. It was great.
it was great talking to you, and I will see you later.
All righty. Bye-bye now.